The rain had been falling since dawn, steady and cold, painting the windows of the towering Manhattan penthouse in watery streaks. The sky was a dull sheet of gray, offering no promise of light or warmth, and below, the city crawled with blurred headlights and umbrellas moving like insects. Inside the sterile quiet of the penthouse, everything looked untouched: pristine marble floors, dark glass surfaces, and an eerie silence that mirrored the man standing before the mirror in his bedroom. Alexander Knight adjusted the cufflinks of his tailored black suit, his expression unreadable. He was the kind of man who inspired fear in boardrooms and commanded respect with a single glance, but this morning, he looked like a statue, flawless, expensive, and utterly lifeless. He stared at his reflection without really seeing it. The man looking back at him had everything: power, wealth, legacy. And yet, a strange weight pressed on his chest. He ignored it, brushing imaginary lint from his jacket sleeve. Today was business. Nothing more. Just another contract coming to an end. The divorce proceedings had been set in motion months ago, the lawyers had already drawn the lines, and all that remained was the final signature. Clean. Controlled. Cold. She hadn't lived here in nearly 7 months. The absence had been sharp at first, like a cut that burned every time he walked past the untouched pillow on her side of the bed or saw the faint trace of her perfume lingering on the hallway rug. But time, and pride, had numbed him. He told himself she had left because she got what she wanted: his name, his child, and a future funded by his fortune. That was how women like Isabelle operated, right? Soft smiles, big eyes, promises wrapped in warmth. He had fallen for it like a fool. And now, he was fixing it. Alexander stepped into the kitchen, poured himself a black coffee he barely tasted, and let his eyes wander across the skyline beyond the glass. Everything felt frozen in place, including him. He didn't want to admit he'd thought about this day more than once. Not with anxiety. Not with regret. Just curiosity. What would she wear? Would she cry? Would she look broken or smug? He hated himself for even caring. He had buried the memories: the first time he saw her laugh in his private garden, how she used to dance barefoot in the kitchen on Sundays, the sound of her humming when she thought he was asleep. He pushed them down like unwanted ghosts. He checked the time. Still an hour before the hearing. His lawyer had sent him a message, reminding him to keep his responses formal and direct. The less said, the better, it read. That was fine by him. Talking had never solved anything in his experience. It only gave people the opportunity to lie. And if there was one thing Alexander Knight no longer believed in, it was honesty wrapped in love. She had been his weakness, once. A risk he thought he could control. But she'd turned the game around with one word: pregnant. From that moment, everything had changed. He set the empty coffee mug on the counter, grabbed his coat, and turned toward the elevator. The air in the penthouse felt thinner than usual, as if it, too, was ready to be rid of memories. He didn't look back as the doors closed behind him. There was nothing left to look at. As the elevator descended, Alexander adjusted his tie with mechanical precision. Today wasn't about pain. It wasn't about love, either. It was about closure. And if the tabloids were hungry for drama, they could look elsewhere. He had no intention of giving them a show. Still, as the elevator hummed down toward the underground garage, a thought crept into his mind, quiet, unwanted, and sharp. He hadn't seen her in months. Not a photo. Not even a message. That was strange, wasn't it? For someone so determined to leave, she'd left everything behind, even the spotlight. But he shook the thought away. Irrelevant. In less than 2 hours, she'd no longer be his problem. And he'd finally be free. As the elevator doors opened, he stepped out into the dim concrete of the parking structure, pulled the collar of his coat up against the drizzle, and whispered to no one, "Let's get this over with." 2 years earlier, on a spring evening that smelled of cherry blossoms and city smog, Alexander Knight met Isabelle for the first time. He hadn't planned to attend the gallery opening. It was a favor for a business partner, one of those social obligations he endured in silence, wearing his usual polished smile and drinking expensive champagne like it was medicine. He had been standing in front of a massive abstract painting that looked like someone had thrown emotion onto canvas without a plan when he heard laughter, soft, unfiltered, and completely out of place among the stiff, curated crowd. He turned instinctively, already annoyed, but his breath caught the moment his eyes found her. She was across the room, leaning slightly toward a little girl holding a juice box and pointing excitedly at a sculpture. Isabelle wasn't dressed like the others. Her dress was simple, not branded, and her heels were scuffed, as if they had seen more sidewalks than limousines. But she had a glow to her, a realness that cut through the noise and artifice. When their eyes met, she smiled. Not the careful, practiced kind he was used to, but a warm, honest smile that made him feel like he'd been seen for the first time in years. She walked over, unbothered by the men in tuxedos or the icy women holding flutes of champagne. She asked what he thought of the painting he was pretending to admire. When he replied with some dry remark about abstract art being a rich man's excuse for confusion, she laughed again, open, amused, alive. He learned later that she was a teacher, volunteering at an art nonprofit for inner-city kids. She was there that night because one of her students had work on display. She didn't recognize him at first, not fully. His last name rang a bell, but she wasn't impressed by it. She told him he seemed like someone who had forgotten how to breathe. That night, they ended up walking along the river for hours, talking about childhood memories, books they never finished, and fears they never said out loud. For the first time in years, Alexander felt himself unraveling, layer by guarded layer, and he didn't stop it. Their love bloomed quickly, like a wildfire during drought. Within a few weeks, she was spending weekends at his penthouse. He learned she had a habit of talking to plants as if they were people, that she cried during documentaries about sea turtles, and that she never went to bed without brushing her hair exactly 100 times. He found himself craving her presence, the way she filled silence with something soothing instead of suffocating, the way her fingers traced his when she thought he was asleep, and how she looked at him like he was more than just a name on a Forbes list. She saw the boy who used to build Lego skyscrapers in his room and dreamed of being someone that mattered, not someone rich, but someone good. But the world around them didn't like the mismatch. His friends smirked behind cocktails. His family wasn't so subtle. His mother called her unsuitable, and his father warned him that love had no place in legacy. The pressure mounted quietly but persistently. Then came the prenup conversation. It was supposed to be procedural. A formality. But Isabelle's face darkened the moment his lawyer presented the documents. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with this expression he could never forget, hurt mixed with disappointment, like someone had slapped her with a truth she wasn't ready to face. "You don't trust me," she said simply, folding the papers without reading them. "You never really did." They fought that night. Not just about the prenup, but about everything that had remained unsaid, the looming differences between their worlds, the way his work always came first, the fact that his phone seemed more important than her voice. And then, almost like the universe was playing a cruel joke, she told him she was pregnant. The words hung between them like a bomb waiting to detonate. She was scared. He was stunned. She said she hadn't planned it, hadn't even known for sure until that morning. But what she needed, what she begged for, was reassurance. A promise that they were in this together. Instead, he went silent. In the days that followed, the space between them widened. He didn't say much. He buried himself in meetings, told himself he needed time to think, to figure it out. Isabelle, in turn, pulled back. She stopped texting him in the middle of the day. She stopped waiting up for him at night. And when he did come home, the warmth in her eyes had dimmed. Every conversation felt loaded. Every touch felt hesitant. They were no longer lovers or even friends, they were two people clinging to an idea that was slipping through their fingers. By the time she quietly moved her things out of the penthouse, there was no grand fight, no dramatic goodbye. Just silence and distance. She didn't ask for anything, not even money. She just left. And Alexander, drowning in ego and confusion, let her go. He convinced himself it was all calculated. That she'd return once she realized the value of what she'd lost. That her silence was manipulation, not heartbreak. But deep down, buried beneath the ice, a part of him knew he had already broken something that might never be whole again. The courtroom was quieter than Alexander expected. A low murmur of rustling papers and hushed whispers filled the air, but otherwise, the space felt suspended, stagnant, almost sterile. The wood-paneled walls and the dull gleam of the floor beneath his polished shoes reflected nothing back at him. He sat rigid at the long polished table, his lawyer beside him murmuring something about protocol and signatures, but Alexander barely registered the words. His fingers tapped idly on the oak, betraying the calm he wore on the surface. He had been in countless courtrooms before, over contracts, acquisitions, lawsuits, but never like this. Never with something personal at stake. And yet, he told himself, this wasn't personal anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. He glanced at the empty seat across from him and then at the courtroom clock. 3 minutes past the scheduled start time. She was late. Typical. Maybe she wouldn't show up. Maybe she'd send her lawyer in her place to sign away the last threads of what had once, briefly, been a life together. The thought stirred something bitter in his chest, but he ignored it. He focused on the judge's bench, the bailiff pacing slowly in front of it, the slight creak of the old courthouse's high ceiling as if the building itself was holding its breath. And then the doors opened. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. No crashing entrance or sudden hush. But somehow, the energy in the room shifted so abruptly it was palpable. Heads turned. The murmurs stopped. And Alexander, despite himself, looked. She stood just beyond the threshold, framed by the double wooden doors like she had stepped out of a memory too beautiful to be real. Isabelle. Her hair was longer now, cascading in soft waves down her shoulders, and her skin had the kind of glow that defied sadness. She wore a white maternity dress, fitted delicately around her growing belly, and yet nothing about her seemed fragile. She walked with quiet grace, every step measured and unshaken. Her back was straight, her chin lifted. There was no hint of hesitation in her eyes. And she was breathtaking. Even the camera lenses from the tabloid journalists, seated quietly in the back row despite courtroom restrictions, seemed to click more frequently, drawn to the scene that no one had expected to be quite so cinematic. The billionaire's estranged wife, radiant and pregnant, walking into court like a woman who had already won something more important than the case. Alexander didn't breathe for a moment. His heartbeat stumbled, then caught rhythm again, louder than before. He watched her approach with a strange mixture of awe and disbelief. It was as if he had never really seen her until now. Not like this. Not with this light in her eyes. She didn't look hurt. She didn't look angry. She looked resolved. Like someone who had let go of something heavy and survived it. She didn't glance around nervously, didn't falter under the stares of strangers or the weight of judgment. When her gaze finally met his, it held for only a second, brief but striking. And in that second, Alexander felt something deep inside him stir. Guilt? Regret? He wasn't sure. But it hit him hard enough to make him swallow tightly. Still, he didn't move. He didn't speak. His lawyer leaned toward him slightly, whispering something again, but he didn't hear it. His eyes were locked on her as she took her seat beside her own attorney, as if she hadn't just shaken the ground beneath his feet by simply existing in that room. He clenched his jaw, trying to control the storm quietly rising inside him. She looked peaceful. Confident. Untouched by the months of silence or the emotional wreckage they had left behind. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt something unfamiliar tug at his carefully guarded pride, fear. Fear that she had healed. Fear that she was never coming back. And worst of all, fear that he had made the biggest mistake of his life, and today, in front of strangers and the law, he would watch that mistake become permanent. But pride was still stronger. So he sat still. Stone-faced. Unmoving. He told himself it didn't matter. But as she shifted slightly in her chair and rested a hand gently on her belly, Alexander couldn't look away. He just couldn't. The room was too quiet for what it represented. A place where lives unraveled, where names were severed from vows, and where love, if it had ever been real, was reduced to legal language. The murmurs from before had vanished, and all that remained now was formality. Structure. Procedure. But underneath the silence, tension crawled like a living thing. It wrapped around the furniture, clung to the walls, settled between every pair of eyes in the courtroom. Alexander could feel it tightening across his chest, a pressure he hadn't anticipated. He was used to tension, negotiations, hostile takeovers, boardroom battles, but this was different. This wasn't a battle of money or strategy. This was personal. And the battlefield was carved from silence. The lawyers did most of the talking at first. Polite, professional, rehearsed. They used phrases like amicable dissolution, mutual agreement, irreconcilable differences, as though the unraveling of two lives could be measured by bullet points and legal clauses. Alexander's attorney read from a document outlining property division, asset reassignment, custody arrangements for the unborn child, things he had barely glanced at during preparation. Isabelle's lawyer nodded at the right moments, occasionally leaned over to whisper something that she acknowledged with a slight nod or blink, but otherwise, Isabelle remained still. She didn't fidget. She didn't flinch. She sat with her hands gently folded in her lap, her belly rising beneath her white dress like the center of gravity had shifted and she was its anchor. Her expression was composed, unreadable, and maddeningly calm. Alexander found himself watching her more than the proceedings, unable to interpret what that calmness meant. Was it confidence? Relief? Contempt? Or worse, indifference? He wasn't used to being ignored. And now, her silence felt louder than anything in the room. She hadn't looked at him since she sat down. Not even once. That irritated him more than he wanted to admit. He expected, what, exactly? A glance of sorrow? A flicker of regret? Something that would show she still cared, that she still felt the sting of this moment as sharply as he did. But she gave him nothing. It was as if he no longer existed in the space she occupied. He shifted in his seat, the leather groaning softly beneath him, and cleared his throat in a way that felt performative, but she didn't react. She just continued to listen, her face a mask of serenity. And then came the moment. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel, finally looked up from the paperwork with finality. Her gavel hadn't struck yet, but everyone knew what was coming. "Mrs. Knight," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "Is this your voluntary agreement to proceed with the dissolution of this marriage as stated?" The words hit harder than Alexander expected. Dissolution. Not separation. Not closure. Dissolution, like something melted away until it was unrecognizable. And then came the silence. Isabelle didn't answer. The courtroom held its breath, the kind of pause that felt both infinite and unbearably short. Her lawyer gently leaned toward her, whispering something too low to hear, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the judge now, but something in her body shifted, barely noticeable, yet suddenly powerful. A slow inhale. Her fingers uncurling from each other. Her shoulders tightening ever so slightly. Alexander leaned forward just a bit, his brows furrowing. What was she doing? She still hadn't answered. He felt his pulse rise in his neck, steady and sharp. For a moment, he thought she might cry. Or walk out. Or say something, anything, to break the script that had been so meticulously planned. His lawyer stirred beside him, sensing the sudden deviation, but Alexander didn't look at him. His entire focus was on her. Isabelle finally blinked. Her lips parted. And then she hesitated again. It wasn't fear. It wasn't uncertainty. It was something else. A choice, maybe. A calculation. A final weighing of her own heart against the silence of his. To the world, it lasted no more than 5 seconds. But to Alexander, it stretched like an hour. In that moment, something primal and terrifying twisted inside him, an urge to speak, to stop her, to reach for her hand like he used to in the dark when neither of them could sleep. But he didn't move. Pride still held him prisoner. She looked down for a brief second. A single breath passed her lips. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the moment passed. She lifted her head slowly, looked at the judge again, and opened her mouth to speak. The break came like a sigh after a long-held breath. The judge called for a short recess before the final paperwork was to be reviewed and signed. The room slowly began to stir, lawyers standing to stretch, hushed voices exchanging quiet updates. But Alexander remained seated, his back straight, his hands clasped together on the table as if still bracing for something he couldn't name. Across the room, Isabelle stood calmly, speaking briefly with her lawyer, then turning to walk toward the door that led to the hallway just outside the courtroom. As she passed Alexander's table, she paused. For the first time since the hearing began, she looked directly at him. Their eyes met, brief, but no longer empty. There was something in her gaze now. Not cold. Not angry. Just steady. She reached into her purse and pulled out a plain white envelope, then gently placed it on the table in front of him. Her voice was soft, not meant for anyone else to hear. You should read this before you sign anything. And then she was gone. He stared at the envelope for a long time, not touching it. Something about its simplicity made it heavier than it looked. No name written on the front, no dramatic gesture, just a sealed piece of paper between two people who used to share everything. For a few seconds, he debated leaving it untouched. Part of him didn't want to give her the satisfaction of thinking he still cared, still needed answers. But something else, deeper and harder to silence, nudged at his curiosity. Eventually, he picked it up. He didn't read it in the courtroom. Instead, he stepped outside into the hallway, walking to the far end where tall windows looked out over the city. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, gray like unfinished thoughts. He leaned against the cool wall, carefully opened the envelope, and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was hers, he remembered it well. Neat, elegant, a little loop on her lowercase y that always made her notes feel more personal. And then he began to read. Alexander. If you're reading this, then part of you still wonders what happened between us. Maybe part of you still thinks I used you, that I planned everything, that the pregnancy was some manipulative trick to tie myself to your world. But that's not the truth. Not even close. The night I told you I was pregnant wasn't part of some plan. It happened after you asked me to stay. After you told me you wanted to build something together. I remember you holding me that night, whispering that you'd never felt this way before. It wasn't me who pushed for more, it was you. You were the one who wanted to stop pretending we were just temporary. When I found out I was pregnant, I was scared, but I was ready to face it. With you. I believed in us, even when everything around us kept trying to tell me we wouldn't make it. But then something changed. Not in me, in you. You stopped looking at me the same way. You started pulling away, making decisions without me, treating me like I was part of a plan you needed to control. And no matter what I did, I couldn't reach you. The walls kept growing, and I was suffocating behind them. Your family hated me. Your world judged me. And still, I stayed. I stayed until I couldn't anymore. I saw how miserable you were becoming. I saw how every time you looked at me, you didn't see the woman you loved, you saw a mistake you didn't want to claim. So I left. Not because I stopped loving you. I never stopped. I still don't think I have. I left because I realized I couldn't force someone to choose me. I couldn't keep trying to prove I was worthy of standing beside you. I wanted you to want me freely. Not out of duty. Not because of a child. But because you looked at me and saw something worth fighting for. And you never asked me what I wanted. Not once. Not when we argued. Not when I cried. Not even when I walked away. It was always about what you needed. What you decided. What you could tolerate. So this letter isn't to guilt you or change your mind. It's just to tell the truth, one last time. Because even now, as we prepare to end this, you deserve to know. You never asked me what I wanted, it was always your choice. Isabelle. Alexander didn't move for a long time after finishing the letter. The words pressed into his chest like weights. He read it again. Then again. And with each read, something inside him cracked a little more. He realized how much he had assumed. How little he had asked. And how far she'd gone to preserve her own heart when he'd left hers to weather the storm alone. The envelope slipped from his hand and landed on the floor, but he didn't notice. All he could think was, what if it was never about the divorce? What if it was about finally being heard? The hallway felt too narrow, too confining, so Alexander pushed open the heavy courthouse doors and stepped outside. The air was thick with moisture, the last remnants of the morning rain clinging to the stone steps and the scent of petrichor rising from the concrete. He inhaled deeply, hoping the coolness would numb the ache crawling up his chest, but it didn't. The city moved around him, cars passing, people talking, horns blaring, but it all felt distant, muffled, like he was stuck behind glass, watching life go on while his own had frozen in place. He walked a few steps toward the edge of the courtyard, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, and tilted his head back. The clouds had thinned, but the sky remained colorless. Much like how he felt, emptied, drained of excuses. He thought fresh air might help clear his head, but it only seemed to sharpen everything that had been dull for so long. Her letter echoed in his mind, every word a mirror he hadn't asked to face. And now, away from the courtroom, away from the pride he wore like armor, Alexander let the truth catch up to him. He remembered her laughter first. It used to fill the walls of his penthouse like sunlight. She laughed with her whole body, head tilted back, eyes squinting, that slight snort she tried to hide when she was really amused. He had loved that laugh once. It had made everything feel less heavy. God, she used to dance when she cooked. She would sway barefoot in his kitchen, music playing from her phone, singing along like no one was watching. And he used to watch. Quietly. Smiling when she wasn't looking. He never told her, but it was in those moments he felt most human. Then came the memories he'd buried. The sacrifices she made. How she never once asked for access to his money. How she took cabs instead of letting him buy her a car. How she insisted on keeping her job at the nonprofit even when he offered to support her fully. How she tried, over and over again, to bridge the gap between their worlds. And he let her. He watched her bend, shrink herself, compromise again and again, just to stay by his side. And when she finally broke, he blamed her for it. The image of her sitting on the edge of their bed that night flashed before his eyes. The night she told him she was pregnant. Her hands had been shaking slightly. Her voice had cracked halfway through. She had looked so scared, not of being pregnant, but of losing him. Of what he might say. And what had he said? Nothing. That was the worst part. He had stared at her, emotionless, calculating. His mind had gone to lawyers, to inheritance, to how the media might spin it. He hadn't even reached out to hold her. He had stood there, cold and detached, while the woman he claimed to love trembled under the weight of carrying their child alone. And when she cried, when the silence became too much and she buried her face in her hands, he had simply walked out of the room. Not out of anger. Out of cowardice. Alexander leaned forward slightly, gripping the black iron railing near the stairs. His knuckles turned white. The truth slammed into him with a force that took his breath away. She was never the manipulator. She had never once used him, never once asked for more than what he claimed he was already giving. It wasn't her who ruined the relationship. It was him. His inability to trust. His refusal to be vulnerable. His constant need to control. He had built the walls she eventually had no choice but to walk away from. And now, standing here with the cold air biting at his face, regret wrapped itself around him like chains. It wasn't anger that burned in his chest. It wasn't even grief. It was shame. Crushing, suffocating shame. He had failed her. And worse, he had failed himself. The soft echo of his footsteps filled the hallway as Alexander made his way back toward the courtroom. His pace wasn't rushed, but something urgent pulsed beneath each step, like a drumbeat pushing him forward. His heart thudded against his ribs, his fingers tightening into fists then loosening again. He had never second-guessed a decision in his life, until now. The letter was still in his hand, creased from how tightly he had been holding it. Her words still rang in his mind, sharp and clear, stripping him of every excuse he had ever hidden behind. And now he knew, this wasn't just about divorce. This was about everything they had left unsaid, undone, and unresolved. He paused at the courtroom doors for a breath, then pushed them open. Everyone turned. He stepped inside, aware of the sudden shift in atmosphere. His lawyer stood, surprised, already half prepared to hand over the final papers. The judge looked up from her bench with the same neutral expectation she had held all day, though there was a slight wrinkle of curiosity between her brows. Isabelle was already seated, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. She looked serene, but the moment she saw him walking toward the center of the room, her eyes flickered. Subtle, but he saw it. Confusion. Then caution. He stopped at the edge of the table, his voice steady but thick. "Your Honor," he said, turning to face the judge. I need to speak." The room stilled. Lawyers glanced at each other. Even the bailiff paused mid-step. The judge leaned back slightly, assessing him. "Mr. Knight, this is highly irregular," she said. "We're moments from concluding a mutually agreed dissolution." "I know," Alexander interrupted, then quickly softened his tone. "I know. But I can't go through with this. Not yet. Not like this." A hush fell over the courtroom. Isabelle sat completely still, her eyes locked on him now, searching his face for meaning. His lawyer stepped forward in confusion, whispering something urgent, but Alexander ignored him. Instead, he took a slow breath and raised the letter in his hand. "She gave me this," he said, lifting the envelope. "Just before the recess. I've read it 3 times now. And I think everyone should hear it." He unfolded it, eyes glancing down at her handwriting, and began to read aloud. His voice trembled at first but grew firmer with each line. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was scared, but I was ready to face it. With you. I believed in us, even when everything around us kept trying to tell me we wouldn't make it. But you stopped looking at me the same way. I couldn't force someone to choose me. I wanted you to want me freely." He paused, his voice catching in his throat. "And you never asked me what I wanted. It was always your choice." Silence. Complete silence. Not even the distant shuffle of papers or coughs broke the stillness. The judge looked genuinely caught off guard, her gavel motionless in her hand. The lawyers stood like statues, not sure if they were still participants or just witnesses now. Alexander turned from the bench and faced Isabelle directly. The weight in his eyes was unguarded, vulnerable, uncharacteristically bare. "I read those words," he said, voice quieter now, meant only for her, "and I realized I never really listened. Not once. You were trying to love me, and I made you feel like a burden. Like a stranger. I was so focused on controlling everything, I lost the one thing that mattered." Isabelle didn't move, but her eyes had begun to glisten. She pressed her lips together, the composure she wore like armor starting to crack. "I don't want this divorce," he said, stepping closer. "Not because I'm afraid of being alone. Not because of the baby. But because I still love you. And I know that now, in a way I should have known all along. I don't expect forgiveness today. I don't even expect an answer. But I had to try." He took a breath, the moment stretching like wire between them. "Can we start again?" he asked softly. The question hung there in the air, fragile and trembling. Every person in the courtroom seemed to be holding their breath, unsure whether they were intruding on something sacred or witnessing something broken being reborn. The judge remained silent. No one moved. All eyes were on Isabelle. And in that stillness, everything hinged on the look in her eyes. Isabelle didn't respond right away. She sat there, frozen, as if the room itself had blurred and only Alexander's voice had cut through the haze. His words hung in the silence, suspended between them like fragile glass, waiting to either shatter or be carefully caught. Her hand, still resting over her belly, tightened slightly, as though anchoring herself to the only part of her life that had felt certain in recent months. Her eyes didn't leave his, not for a second, but her expression was unreadable, neither rejection nor forgiveness, just a quiet storm beneath the surface. Then, slowly, she stood. The sound of the chair scraping the floor was almost startling in the quiet courtroom. Everyone turned, breath held. Her lawyer reached out instinctively, murmuring her name, but she raised one hand slightly, stopping him without looking. Her gaze was still fixed on Alexander, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but laced with something deeper than sadness. It was tired, resolute, and achingly honest. "I don't know if it's too late," she said, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "I really don't." Alexander opened his mouth, but she shook her head gently. "I've loved you for so long," she continued. "I loved you when you were cold, when you were distracted, when I felt like I was the only one trying to hold us together. I stayed through everything, hoping you'd see me. Hoping you'd choose me." She took a small step forward, enough to close some of the distance between them. Her eyes searched his face, every line, every flicker of emotion, like she was trying to memorize it, or perhaps searching for something she wasn't sure was there. "But I can't be the only one fighting anymore, Alexander," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Not again. Not this time." A hush swept over the room like wind through a hollow. Her words didn't need to be louder, they landed like thunder. And yet, in the very center of her pain, there was something else in her expression. A flicker. A warmth. Not forgiveness, not yet. But hope. Fragile and trembling, but alive. Without another word, Isabelle turned. She walked toward the exit slowly, every step echoing like a heartbeat. When she reached the door, she paused, but didn't look back. She left without signing. 1 month passed, not with fanfare or dramatic declarations, but with quiet effort and change. Alexander Knight, once the untouchable billionaire whose calendar was carved from stone, had stepped away from the whirlwind of board meetings and endless deals. For the first time in years, he was learning to be still. His penthouse, once a cold monument to power, had grown quieter in a different way, gentler, almost human. He spent mornings walking in the park, afternoons in therapy, and evenings writing things he never had the courage to say out loud before. Letters. Messages. Apologies. Every day he sent something to Isabelle. A bouquet of her favorite lilies, a handwritten note folded inside. A voice message where he read her a passage from the book they'd once started together but never finished. A poem. A simple thinking of you. He didn't ask for anything in return, just that she knew he was trying. Not to win her back, but to become the man he should have been all along. She didn't reply at first. But she didn't block him either. And that was something. Then, after a week of silence, a single message arrived. Coffee. Saturday. 10 a.m. Don't be late. The coffee shop was small and tucked between brownstone buildings on a quiet street. The kind of place Isabelle had always preferred, unpretentious, with the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread in the air. Alexander arrived early, nerves buzzing beneath his crisp shirt, and waited with his hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold. And then the door opened. She walked in slowly, carefully, a soft pink blanket cradled in her arms. Her face was tired, but radiant, and her smile, when she saw him, was cautious but real. Alexander stood, heart thudding, unable to take his eyes off the tiny bundle she held to her chest. His daughter. Their daughter. "Hi," Isabelle said quietly. "Hi," he breathed, voice thick. She's beautiful. Would you like to hold her?" His breath caught, and he nodded. She stepped forward, gently placing the baby in his arms. He held her awkwardly at first, terrified he might break something so small, so perfect. But then she sighed, a soft, sleepy sound, and nestled against his chest like she'd been waiting for him. Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry I missed this," he whispered, barely able to speak. Isabelle sat across from him, watching. "You still have time," she said softly. "But don't waste another second." He looked up, and for the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel out of reach. It felt possible. Sometimes, we don't realize the value of a moment until it's gone. That's what people say, right? And I used to think it was just something people told themselves to feel better about regret. But I know now, it's true. I didn't see what I had when I had it. I was too proud, too guarded, too blind. I mistook her love for weakness. I mistook her patience for obligation. And by the time I saw what she truly was, I almost lost her. But life, in its rarest mercy, sometimes offers you a second chance. Not a reset. Not a clean slate. Just a moment. A breath. An opportunity to show up differently than you did before. And if you're lucky, if you're brave, you take it. It's been quiet since that day in court. Not the kind of quiet I used to chase, sterile, detached, but the kind that fills the room with warmth. With growth. I still don't have all the answers. I still wake up with guilt some days, thinking of how easily I let fear take the place of love. But I don't run from it anymore. I face it. I work on it. Because she's worth that. Because we're worth that. And now, on a sunlit afternoon, here we are. The stroller glides smoothly over the park trail. Leaves rustle gently in the breeze above us. Children laugh in the distance. Isabelle walks beside me, her hand resting in mine like it belongs there. Like it always did. Our daughter stirs in her stroller, letting out a soft coo, and we both glance down instinctively, smiling. There's a peace to this moment I never thought I'd know. A softness in her eyes when she looks at me, not because I earned her trust again yet, but because I'm finally trying to. Every day. Not for show. Not for forgiveness. But because it's the right thing to do. She glances at me, and I squeeze her hand. She doesn't speak, but she doesn't need to. As we walk, I think about the courtroom, the silence, the letter that changed everything. I think about the man I was and the man I'm becoming. And I think, finally, I understand. She looked radiant that day, not because she was leaving me, but because she finally knew her worth. And now, so did I.